Good morning. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, so this presentation for Social Sciences Week is on the research on intergenerational trauma. So trauma as symptoms and experiences affecting not only the original survivor, but also subsequent generations, and the relevance of this research for child protection systems and contexts. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we're meeting on today. I'm meeting from Ngarigo country, and I'd like to thank the traditional owners for the care of this beautiful land over so many generations. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people meeting today. Just to introduce myself briefly. So my name is Krista Bowe. So I'm a PhD candidate with Charles Sturt University, and my research is on the topic of intergenerational child maltreatment, so where children experience abuse or neglect over 2 or more generations in the same family. Part of the research I'm doing also looks at what practitioners and policymakers and researchers in the field of intergenerational child maltreatment can learn from the wider research on intergenerational trauma. So that concept of intergenerational trauma has been studied in many cohorts over several decades. It includes studies into people who have experienced the Holocaust and other genocides, war, colonisation, and forced geographical dislocation. But these findings, I don't think, have been very well integrated into the field of child protection. So this is an attempt to bridge this gap. I'm also a social worker. I currently work for New South Wales Health in the IVANS team, so Integrated Violence, Abuse and Neglect. So providing counselling and therapeutic support for children and families who have experienced abuse or neglect. And prior to that, I worked in other similar settings, including statutory child protection for a number of years. So my interest in this topic really comes from both a practice and a research perspective. An outline of what we're going to talk about today. We'll begin with some of the research on child maltreatment that reoccurs over generations, just to get a sense of the lay of the land, where the current research is sitting, and what the research directions are looking like. Then we'll go through some of the findings and insights from the field of intergenerational trauma, and then we'll talk about the science, so the biology of intergenerational trauma, including the epigenetic influences. And to finish, I'll summarise and really emphasise and scaffold out the potential implications for policy, practice and future research. Okay, so intergenerational child maltreatment. So this is where parents or grandparents who experience abuse or neglect in their childhood go on to have descendants who are also subjected to maltreatment. The reported rates vary very widely. So there was one scoping review mentioned here of 51 studies into the rates of intergenerational child maltreatment, and it found prevalence rates to be between 7% and 88%, so a fairly big range. This is possibly due to some differences in the research approaches and parameters, which has really led to a call for future research directions and a sort of critique of the way some of the research has been conducted so far. So several studies depend on, standardised or societal kind of definitions of child maltreatment. Sometimes the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or other questionnaires, or legislations, or cultural definitions. And of course, these vary from country to country and culture to culture. So there's a call for some consistent definitions of what constitutes child maltreatment. Some studies depend on self-report, so they were relying on research participants' disclosures of abuse to the researchers. And this is affected by memory bias, and we're aware that experiences of trauma have a big impact on how we remember experiences that have occurred. Also affected by our tendencies to either idealise or sometimes demonise parents in situations where there's been childhood maltreatment or adversity, and also affected by individual beliefs about what constitutes child maltreatment. So there's a call really for studies that follow people over generations and are prospective rather than retrospective, relying on that memory sort of recall. Other studies rely on child protection data. These are criticised because they focus on an already at-risk group, so the rates are likely to be higher. There's a call for including research participants who are representative of the general population, and also a call for research into the protective or resilience factors. So how people break the cycle, what people find helpful from a lived experience perspective. There's been some suggestions that sibling studies might be a really good way of studying this, because often siblings experience similar experiences in childhood, but often grow up to have very different sort of trajectories and experiences in adulthood. There's an over-attention to mothers in the literature, very few studies on fathers specifically, and how intergenerational transmission occurs through the paternal line. And biological and epigenetic knowledge is a growing area of research, and a really interesting one. So there's calls for more attention here in the research on intergenerational child maltreatment. Others have recommended that gender pathways are explored more thoroughly. So through social roles and conditioning and expectations, girls are traditionally really thought of sometimes as the caregivers and are sort of socially conditioned that way. And therefore, they may have more attunement to the distress of others and be more affected by the trauma and intergenerational child maltreatment of their parents. That's one hypothesis. And there are also some potential biological factors here, which we'll go into later. And the research is critiqued a little for limiting the studies to only 2 generations. So there's a call for studies into 3 or more generations that are a possibility to reveal patterns and the potential that vulnerabilities might skip a generation sometimes and become a challenge for grandchildren or great-grandchildren. The really key message in the literature is that it's not fatalistic, it's not predetermined. Many people, likely the majority, go on to parent really successfully after a history of child maltreatment or in a way that doesn't result in harm to their children. However, most studies do find some correlation between maltreatment in childhood and going on to have children who also experience maltreatment. Here's a couple of examples of this. So these are 2 separate studies. The table on the left, the green one, is a study conducted using South Australia child protection data. So the SA here stands for South Australia. So it looks at parents who had a child protection history and the reports, substantiations and entries into out-of-home care of their children, if they had children in South Australia. It's retrospective, so based on child protection data from 1986 to 2017. And as you can see, there's a fairly large disparity for child protection involvement between children whose parents had a child protection history and those who didn't, particularly the spending time in out-of-home care, 10.7% for children of parents with a child protection history, 0.5% for those without. This study on the right was a population study on teen mothers in California in 2006 and 2007. So it used birth records of mothers aged 15 to 19 and linked those mothers to their own child protection data, focusing on abuse that occurred when they were 10 or older. And then they followed up over 5 years to see whether there were then reports or other child protection involvement for their children. Again, you can see the disparity. Reports are almost double for mothers with a child protection history and more than triple for substantiations. So this slide reveals the factors the researchers identified that mediate or moderate the risk of intergenerational transmission of child maltreatment. So these parents are often referred to as cycle breakers or cycle maintainers. So parents that had a lot of social and family support often fared better in parenting their children, as did those who had integrated and processed their own trauma experiences, whether that was through formal therapy and counselling or some other role. In any case, they were able to sort of talk about, recall, think through, make sense of their own childhood experiences and weren't sort of triggered or dissociated by recalling them. Mental health was a mediating or moderating factor, particularly dissociation. Parents who displayed mental health symptoms, including dissociation, struggled to attend to their children as much. Level of education, so parents who achieved a higher level of education, and the age at which they began parenting. So young parents had more struggles raising children without childhood maltreatment. And this one seems like a no-brainer to me, but practical and financial resources versus, disadvantage and stress and systemic adversity. Parents who had some of those basic needs met to a large degree were able to parent with less likelihood of their child experiencing maltreatment than those who were struggling with poverty and homelessness and financial disadvantage. I want to present some of the findings on one of the few qualitative strength-based studies. This is on parent survivors who went on to raise their children without abuse, and it's an American study conducted in the New England region of America. Made 3 main recommendations based on the findings. Firstly, it recommended reconsidering the attachment paradigms or timetables. So really acknowledging that the connection between parent and child might not be automatic. It might take time to build as they sort of build trust in themselves and their relationships. So a couple of quotes here. One parent said, "It took us that first year, me and my son, to get the thing happening that happens to some people instantly. He was trying to bond and I was trying to let him. I thought I was protecting him. I was trying to be very careful because I didn't want to hurt him." And another parent said, "I didn't let myself be that much in love with him because I was so scared of what that could do to us. I think I was a bit standoffish as a mum, and I was breastfeeding and I remember feeling like I've got to make him stop because we're too close." So really sort of giving respect to the fact that attachment may take longer to build. Secondly, recognising and building on the strengths that parents display. And that included their sort of fierce advocacy and protection for their children and commitment to parenting differently to what they had experienced and seeking out of knowledge around how to parent. So one parent said, "I was the fighter back kid. I was the one that fought back. That role as a warrior continues through my life, that I fight back, I protect, I defend. I'm on my kids' side." And another one, which is the part of the title of this paper, "It's going to stop in this generation." Thirdly, the last finding was a model of interactive and flexible parenting approaches was more effective than a model applied in fidelity, such as like Circle of Security or Triple P. So participants talked about taking bits and pieces from what they learned, either in informal conversations or more structured sort of parenting programs, and eventually sort of trusting themselves to know what was needed in the situation. I learned how to trust myself, said one parent. I trust myself a lot more. I know myself well enough to know that I want nothing but good for him, and I have to trust that even my mistakes were okay. Hey, I'm going to move on now to intergenerational trauma. So that's less about the experience of harm over generations and more about the manifestation of trauma sort of symptoms and internal experiences. And as we go through the next slides, we're going to be thinking about how this applies or doesn't apply or can be sort of translated into work with families and individuals who experienced harm in childhood. We do need to be a bit critical and thoughtful when we consider how the research on intergenerational trauma might apply to intergenerational child maltreatment. So there's some nuances about the experiences of child maltreatment that might not be present to the same degree in other trauma experiences. So firstly, if trauma happens in childhood, it's generally considered to be more pervasive, more intense, because of that increased neuroplasticity that's happening in childhood, the developmental acceleration. They're really in that adapting to their environment stage, and if their environmental conditions look a certain way, their internal sort of development is responding. There's also that increase in relational reliance, and that brings about considerations about the source of the harm, the source of the trauma. Child maltreatment often involves harm that comes from the action or the inaction of the parent or the caregiver. So babies and children, they're instinctively drawn towards their parent for survival. The parent provides them, or their caregiver provides them with food, with warmth, with, co-regulation, with nurturing, comfort. So they're born that way. It's not a choice, it's an instinctive drive. They're also born with the instinctive capacity to withdraw in some way or protect themselves in some way from fear and pain and danger. And often that involves approaching the caregiver for their protection and safety. So when the parent is both a source of the nurturing and protection and the source of the danger and harm, they're in this dilemma where these two really innate forces are sort of battling each other. Do I approach or do I withdraw from this parent? Thirdly, trauma is not isolated to one generation in intergenerational trauma, as it was in, for instance, the Holocaust. So the Holocaust was, an extremely traumatizing and awful and profound trauma over, a number of years, but something that had a noticeable and definable end, and therefore maybe more capacity to heal. And lastly, people who experience child maltreatment may be separated from their parents, either through the intervention of states or perhaps through family arrangements, and that might call for the need for the replacement of family healing, which we'll talk about in a minute, where the healing sort of reverberates up and down the generations, to some other form of either individual or relational healing. As a field of research, this area of inquiry began in the 1960s, and it was termed concentration camp syndrome. So psychiatrists were noticing that adolescent children of Holocaust survivors were presenting for help for their mental health at much higher rates than their peers. These early inquiries, mostly case studies, attracted a fair bit of critique for involving a really biased selection of research participants without a control group and really predominantly relying on anecdotal data. However, it was still noticed as a phenomenon. So more controlled and empirical studies started taking place into Holocaust survivors, and then into people who had experienced other forms of trauma, other genocides, refugees and asylum seekers, people who had experienced war either as military service personnel or civilians, slavery, natural disasters, and also colonisation. And I do want to give a little bit more attention to colonisation because it probably has the clearest overlaps with child protection and intergenerational child maltreatment. In many cases, child removal was used as a tool of colonisation, and the rates of child removals today suggest that colonisation is an ongoing contemporary process rather than purely a historic one. For example, in 2021-2022, Indigenous children in Australia accounted for 39% of care orders, despite comprising less than 6% of the population of that age group, 0 to 17. And in Canada, over half of the children in care are Indigenous, while they represent 7.7% of the total population. So it's quite a disparity, and something I always think about when I'm working with any Indigenous families or children. And over time, the research also expanded to the third generation, and we're also now getting some research into the fourth generations. Something to really emphasise is that the resonances of trauma over many generations carries the risk of interpreting trauma responses as either disposition or traits or culture. And therefore, it's really important to hold context and historical context particularly in mind when we're interpreting behaviours. This author, Resmaa Menakem, noted trauma in a person decontextualised over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualised over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualised over time looks like culture. We can apply this and think about this in relation to people who have experienced all kinds of traumas. But as an example, there's a bit of a stereotype in America about African-American parents being more authoritarian, requiring respect and obedience from their children, and also being reported to child protection systems at higher rates. But when we look at it through a historical context, the absolute importance of obedience becomes apparent. And this experience, I think, is not just historic. Racism and oppression is very present today, and something that obedience and deference to authority is a protective factor against. And I'm going to read this quote. It's quite lengthy, but I think it really illustrates the point. From the beginning of their enslavement, all slaves have been confronted with the option to submit or die. And obviously those who survived to rear children had chosen to live and therefore to submit. Once a mother opted for her child's life, she assumed the task of conveying to the child the nature of the world and how to survive in it. In some instances, she had to assume a role much like that of a slave master, sometimes treating the child with capricious cruelty, including hurting the child physically and emotionally, and demanding an obsequious response to the manner she knew would enhance the chances of survival. Particular pains had to be taken to crush any defiant or aggressive responses to certain situations. A mother dared not allow the child to grow up expecting love or loving concern from every source. She had to demand that the child always show the parents the greatest respect. This conditioning would serve as the basis for the later relationship with the slave master. And the less conflict experienced in connection with the slave master and the less conflict experienced in connection with obedience, the greater the likelihood of survival. Yeah, so let that sit with you for a minute. Initially, and also as time went on, the research tended to look at mental health diagnosis. Sometimes there was a correlation between being the child or grandchild of a survivor of trauma and being diagnosed with mental health conditions, particularly in studies on children of people involved in combat and also children of refugees and asylum seekers. Higher levels of ADHD, conduct disorder and PTSD were found, and anxiety and depression. But many studies, when they looked at it based on that criteria, found a null hypothesis. So no statistically significant difference in mental health diagnosis compared to a control group or the general population. But when what we measured was changed from diagnostic criteria to broader challenges, things like difficulties with self-esteem, difficulties with interpersonal experiences, stress and hypervigilance, difficulties separating from parents, all kinds of emotional and relational and behavioural challenges. It was found that there was certainly a correlation there. Children of survivors experienced more challenges in some of these areas than the control groups. Specifically, I do want to mention that these challenges, which sometimes did result in a diagnosis or met the criteria for diagnosis of mental health illness, was sort of instigated by a direct life stressor or an experience of trauma or adversity. So, you know, as we know, when two people experience the same trauma, one might go on to develop PTSD and the other might not. The research found that children and sometimes grandchildren of trauma survivors were more vulnerable to developing PTSD or other mental health challenges when they encountered their own direct life challenges. And they could range from anything from a life-threatening illness, a natural disaster, anxiety about political conflict, their own involvement in war in some form. When we think about that in terms of our work, I wonder if we can't consider parenthood as a stressor for anyone. It's a pretty big and life-changing event. And I wonder about for people who have intergenerational involvement with child protection systems, I think about how much of a trigger for these adversities a phone call or a visit from a statutory child protection practitioner might be. In many of the cohorts that were studied, there's a finding around the effects of trauma narratives within the family and the impacts on subsequent generations. Their research found that survivors often experience this sense of shame. So they were reluctant to talk about their experiences and their losses. So children within the families experience this sense of something being wrong. They could sort of detect the distress, but they didn't have an explanation or a context. And this exacerbated the symptoms that, that children displayed. Equally, and probably most prominent in the literature on war trauma, there could be flooding narratives. So where the survivor parents sort of recounted their experiences in detail and with a lot of distress, and this could result in kind of like a compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma experience for children and others who are exposed to these narratives. Societal responses had an impact on the narratives as well and how they could be articulated. So there was stigma for many many people who had experienced trauma. So in addition, they might be excluded or shunned in society, such as people who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings due to fears about radiation and long-term health issues, children born of wartime rape in Africa. And these children have more of a sense of difficulties, struggles to find sort of belonging and inclusion and acceptance that's, I think, really necessary for healing and recovery. Yael Danieli is a really prolific writer and researcher on Holocaust trauma and intergenerational trauma. She wrote extensively about what she terms the conspiracy of silence. This refers to the sense of shame and silence that was common in survivors, being upheld and maintained by society, basically because generally people sort of felt that the atrocities that happened at those times were too difficult to heal or to acknowledge. They didn't want to sort of get their head around the idea that humans were capable of harming other humans in this way. So they responded with silence, an avoidance of the topic. And this included helping professionals sometimes due to the vicarious trauma and countertransference that discussing these topics might evoke. And the outcome of that could reinforce the idea that, you know, the experiences were too shameful to talk about, that the person who had experienced was sort of irreparably damaged or broken. And it could also position the family home as the only space available for these narratives, thereby resulting in those flooding narratives that could cause that vicarious trauma to children. In Australia, Bill Stanner described the cult of forgetfulness in relation to Indigenous Australians. And that's a really deliberate and systemic forgetting about the experiences of Indigenous people, meaning their perspectives have been largely missing from education and policy and practice. It's a bit different from the conspiracy of silence, because the conspiracy of silence, I think, might be less conscious, more an attempt to avoid internal distress, whereas Stanner's conceptualisation of the cult of forgetfulness was a facet of colonisation and imposition of Western ideals. The research also found strengths and post-traumatic growth in children, and particularly in grandchildren of survivors, that third generation. There was a demonstration of increased compassion for others, for human suffering, a bit of an ethical scrutiny of topics and involvement in politics, tendency towards activism, and an identification with their family and their family members' experience and their culture. That third generation was more likely to talk about the topic, breaking that silence that we just spoke about. And they reported a sense of responsibility to preserve the memories as possibly the last generation to know the original survivor. And they had a real focus on justice and reparation and the strengthening of cultural identity. And all this healing happened not just from the individual, but for the family as a whole. The trauma was really reframed as that silence was broken, and people began to be able to talk about it and heal from it. So those opportunities to engage in activism and to seek justice and to lead and mentor others was a significant opportunity to heal. And I think about where are those spaces in the child protection field, particularly in the literature on geographic displacement. A factor found to increase healing was the regaining of economic stability and status, often through higher education. And in other cohorts, of course, outcomes were worse for subsequent generations if they were also dealing with systemic disadvantages like poverty and racism, dangerous neighbourhoods, oppressive systems. So there's a bit of a sense that eliminating these direct traumas gives people more of a chance. The literature on refugee and asylum seekers found a real concern among parents that their children might become acculturated to the host country and lose their culture and cultural identity. And Indigenous understandings as well, culture and cultural practices are really indivisible from healing. So people spoke about the need to heal in ways that fit with their individual and cultural ways of being. And that wasn't always the talk therapy that's probably still most common in Western societies. People talk about feeling really confused and uncomfortable sometimes when engaging with therapists. And I think about what opportunities therapy and healing spaces provide for other modes of healing, like movement and breath work and art and story and metaphor, and also about respecting privacy values and the role of silence. The other really important opportunity for healing includes the creation and the maintenance of, specific spaces for the sharing of story and narrative. Indigenous perspectives are really at the forefront of this. Kennedy said the process of healing is second nature to Aboriginal people. So processes like Dadiri and therapeutic yarning circles, and in Canada, sharing circles, these all involve this deep reflective listening and sharing, this non-hierarchical and safe sort of space, and a focus on sort of acknowledging historical harms and healing spiritual wounds. I think when we talk about those approaches and implement them, it's really important that that process needs to be Aboriginal-led and applied in its entirety and with fidelity. Otherwise, I think we risk tokenizing almost the practice, or robbing it of all the elements that allow it to sort of do its work in terms of the healing. Okay, we're going to talk about the biological research. Okay, there's been a fair amount of research on the impact of trauma on a person's functioning on a biological level. One perspective looks at how these trauma and maltreatment induced changes affect parenting, and therefore directly affects the experiences of the next generation. So in trauma survivors and their offspring, studies have found reduced brain plasticity. So impacts on the ability for those neuroconnections to sort of form or alter in response to the environment. So it's blunted, it's somewhat hindered in parents who have survived trauma. That might mean a bit more difficulty adapting to change and a bit more rigidity in behaviours. When I think about that, I think about the perinatal phase, pregnancy particularly, when there's a lot of change in hormone levels, and therefore how parents perceive themselves and their role and how they respond to their environment. It's a time of real transformation, I think, on a social and a biological level. I wonder a bit about how that is different for parents who have experienced trauma and therefore have less plasticity. There's also changes to the architecture of the brain. Often the cortex, the thinking and planning and socializing and social engagement sort of part of our brain is impeded because a lot more attention is being directed towards the threat response, the amygdala and other areas in the midbrain. So that cortex helps us to anticipate longer term outcomes of decisions, and it gives us more psychological flexibility, which is, the ability to choose our behaviours rather than just reacting. So a different cortex might mean more reactivity, different responses, reactions to children's behaviours. Also, the research suggests that the corpus callosum, which supports the connection between the right and the left brain, is a bit impeded. And when I think about that, I think about the right to left brain therapeutic approach and theory. So the right brain is felt to hold those implicit memories, often the trauma memories, the memories that sort of emerge in our behaviour, in our body sensations and movements, rather than having a context and a story and a world around it. So often the goal of therapy is considered to be integrating this trauma from the right brain to the left brain, reframe sort of the meanings that have been made of it, give it some knowledge and consideration and allow it to be integrated. So if the corpus callosum is affected by trauma, I do think a bit about what that might mean for the approach we choose when we're working therapeutically with survivors. And, back to what we just discussed about the need for all kinds of therapeutic responses, movement and breath work, and art therapy and play therapy and creativity, rather than simply talk therapy. Most of the research on the biology probably sits with the HPA axis So the hyperpituitary adrenal axis, it's basically our stress response, our sort of automatic response when we're faced with a danger. When we've experienced trauma, especially sort of cumulative, ongoing trauma, this HPA response is shifted into overdrive. It's constantly kind of on alert. In the research, cortisol was found to be either higher or lower in people who had experienced trauma or had PTSD, and is connected with anxiety, depression, and particularly PTSD. So the impact on parenting might include an over-response, sort of anxious or reactive responses to behaviours of children, or sometimes an under-response, characterised by this sort of shutdown and dissociation that might be more connected with neglect. Yeah, so both of those things can be really traumatising to a child if experienced from a parent. The research also finds a reduction in serotonin and oxytocin, so the feel-good hormones, the connecting love hormones, and the receptors for these. So these chemicals are really critical for feelings of connection and with others and for a sense of well-being. So that may go some way to explaining the longer timelines for attachment that we touched on earlier. For mothers or parents with a history of child maltreatment. Oxytocin is also a hormone that's considered a bit of an antidote to cortisol. So it's the hormone that comes along when we're in our stress response. The cortisols and the adrenaline is causing our muscles to tense and we're ready to run or fight or, freeze. And if we don't have enough oxytocin, so what does that mean for the de-escalation of the stress response? Are people stuck in that fight, flight, freeze response for longer and less able to sort of recalibrate themselves and come back to homeostasis? Also, chemicals and hormones that are associated with the physical functions and aspects of parenting are affected by trauma. That includes prenatally and birthing. Oxytocin, we already talked about oxytocin, is also related to breastfeeding. It stimulates the movement of milk into the milk ducts, and it's also impacts on contractions during birth. Studies have also found prolactin. It's also associated with breastfeeding. It stimulates milk production to be reduced in people who have experienced trauma. And I want to mention an enzyme called 11B-HSD2. In pregnant women, this enzyme is located in the placenta, and it helps to translate cortisol. So cortisol is toxic to unborn babies, so it translates cortisol into a non-toxic form, a more palatable form that the unborn baby can, absorb and tolerate. In mothers who have experienced trauma, particularly if this trauma occurred during childhood, that enzyme is found at lower levels than the general population, therefore perhaps exposing babies to more of the toxic impacts of trauma before they're even born. The research also looked at hormone and chemical levels in children and grandchildren and further generations of people who had experienced trauma. So this research looked more at how they might be directly impacted by their ancestors' trauma on a biological level rather than the experiences they've had of parenting. And sometimes this took place through mammal subjects, controlled animal studies over a number of generations. And there are also studies into human subjects through fMRI scans, and measuring levels of hormones in saliva and urine. In relation to those hormonal, biological and neurological changes, findings were reasonably consistent with direct survivors. Cortisol in offspring and subsequent generations was increased or decreased compared to the control groups. And there were similarly reduced levels of serotonin and oxytocin. So I'd theorised that latter point would also have similar effects on the baby's well-being and attachment capacity. So not only is the parent needing more time to attach and bond, but the baby might be too. However, that enzyme in the placenta that I just mentioned, 11B-HSD2, that translates cortisol into a non-toxic form, this exists in people in general. It has other roles, including the regulation of blood pressure. They measured the levels of this in the offspring of trauma survivors, and it was found at much higher levels than their peers. So that sort of indicates what I kind of point to, I could call a bit of an intergenerational balancing act over generations, where maybe compensating for what parents or grandparents couldn't provide at the time. Some studies explored trauma responses in the next generations through looking at behavioural responses in the offspring and in descendants. One study conditioned mice to fear the smell of cherries by pairing it with an electric shock. So the smell of cherries was wafted into the cage, and an electric shock was administered at the same time. And eventually, when the mice smelled that scent, they anticipated the shock, and they had a trembling or bracing or fearful reaction. Now, the study found that not only the generation who was conditioned to fear that scent, but 2 further generations were sensitised to this same fear response. So they were much more easily conditioned to fear the smell of cherries. What that meant was, while the first generation of mice might have needed a dozen electric shocks and cherry smells before they started displaying this trembling fear response, these subsequent generations might have only needed, 3 or 4 or 5 electric shocks paired with the smell of cherries to associate the smell with pain and fear. In this study, reproduction was through IVF, and the offspring was raised by foster parents to eliminate the possibility of social transmission. Another study induced stress on baby mice through this unpredictable maternal separation. So every so often, with no notice and no predictability, they take the mum out of the cage for a little while and then return it. And then they measured over a number of generations the ability of their mice to manage some tests that are believed to predict sort of anxious or depressive responses, like seeing how much they persisted through challenges, how much they approached or withdrew from difficulties. So in 3 further generations, which were conceived by experimental males with naive female mice, and they were reared normally, some level of avoidant and immobility type responses were found in all 4 of those generations. The study also measured the female offspring in each litter. So even though the males, only the males went on to take part in the next bit of the experiment, the females' behaviours were measured too. Male mice in the 2nd generation were less likely to have that depression-like response than their female siblings, so they displayed more resilience. However, the offspring of these male mice of both genders had equal difficulties with the task. So the researchers hypothesised that maybe intergenerational trauma might somehow skip a generation at times, with those male mice being maybe asymptomatic carriers of the trauma. Other studies looked at the health and survivability of the next generations. Some found higher pregnancy losses, some found reduced gestational timeframes, so earlier births. Others found higher levels of mortality in the first month of life. Several of the studies found that offspring of stressed or traumatised parents have shorter telomeres on average. They're caps at the end of the DNA that are associated with health and longevity. They really protect the DNA. And so there's certainly studies as well on child maltreatment and child death reviews that find that people with involvement with child protection systems are at higher risk of death in infancy and childhood. And the most common cause of death is illness and disease. And all this feels a little depressing. So a couple of studies to provide a more hopeful perspective. when an enriched environment was provided, and this looked like consistent access to food and space and some intellectual challenge, some freedom from threat and good maternal care in infancy, those behavioural changes in the vulnerable offspring were able to be reversed. So it's certainly not fatalistic and predetermined that people whose parents have experienced trauma will also have a tough time. The field of epigenetics is very interesting. It essentially studies the markers which appear on the DNA to silence or activate the expression of the DNA. There's been some research into epigenetic markers associated with trauma and the trauma response, so actual physical changes to the way genes are expressed or silenced in descendants of survivors. There are 3 ways that this can happen. The first is epigenetic inheritance. So those are changes to the germ cell itself, the sperm or the oocyte. So generally germ cells undergo kind of a couple of resets, I suppose, where all the epigenetic marks are wiped clear so that the child isn't just a replica or a clone of their parents, but they can develop their own self based on the environmental conditions that they experience. Some of those epigenetic markers are theorised to survive this reset, to help prepare the offspring for the kind of conditions that they might face in life based on their parents' experiences. Another notable thing to mention is that the germ cells of a female child are actually created in utero. So there's a potential for 3 generations to be within the one body. So potentially a grandchild could be directly biologically affected by the grandmother while the grandmother is pregnant with the mother. Whereas sperm is created during the lifespan from adolescence onwards and can only directly biologically affect 2 generations. So that might be one explanation for the gender differences that in intergenerational trauma that we talked about earlier. Fetal epigenetic programming refers to the in utero experiences of the child. So even then, the epigenetic markers start turning on or off, depending on the conditions that unborn child's experiencing. So if the mother's experiencing high stress, perhaps domestic violence, perhaps homelessness and poverty, those epigenetic markers are going to be preparing the child for a life experience where they have to be alert and safety seeking. And thirdly, epigenetic changes continue over the lifespan. So they're constantly shaping which genomes are expressed or silenced based on those changing life conditions. I'm going to quickly revisit a couple of those studies on mammals that I mentioned earlier. And so these studies, or subsequent studies using the same subjects, looked also at the epigenetics and found changes to the methylation of genes related to those same hormones and chemicals that we've been discussing, so oxytocin, cortisol, serotonin. For instance, the study on the smell of cherries, there was a subsequent study. It injected RNA, which is a type of epigenetic, it's kind of a messenger between the cell, the DNA, and the cell. So they injected that into naive mice subjects, so they hadn't been part of any experiment or experienced a electric shock or smell of cherries. What they found is that these subjects also began to experience this same sensitivity and startle response to the smell of cherries. Also, the study on generations of mice who were put through those behavioural tests found differences in those epigenetic markers in the sperm over 3 generations. And those markers are identified as related to an increased stress response. So cortisol and corticoid reactors and depression and the degradation of serotonin. Finally, studies on epigenetic changes over the lifespan put some more hopeful spin on things, I think. So there's been studies on the efficacy of therapy on an epigenetic level. So basically they measured the expression of the genes, the epigenetics, in a certain area, of the genome, which is found to be related to the stress response and the cortisol production and corticoid receptors behaviours. So combat veterans with PTSD who engaged in prolonged exposure therapy and trauma survivors who took part in mindfulness-based therapies, there were changes to that epigenetic expression related to the stress response. So they measured before therapy, they measured after therapy. They found changes to that little epigenetic marker. That meant a less reactive stress response on an epigenetic level following therapy. So really, these studies are showing us that when changes are made on a psychological or a psychosocial level, we can actually physically see the results on a biological and an epigenetic level. We've covered quite a lot in the last 50 minutes or so. I'm just going to summarise what I think are the common themes in the research on intergenerational trauma and their implications for work with families. So it's kind of what I see when I zoom out and try and look at all this information holistically. So firstly, people with ancestors who have survived trauma and maltreatment might be more vulnerable to a number of challenges, and we as a society might diagnose some of these. And this is the case even if they don't have their own direct experiences of trauma, and it occurs on a cellular level as well. So it's important to me that we have an understanding of the person's current and historical and intergenerational history before intervening, based on, certain assumptions that we might make about behaviours or presentations or what's going on. Secondly, direct stress and adversity and trauma can trigger off these challenges, and sometimes towards clinical diagnosis. Some of the biggest stresses there are include parenthood, poverty and oppression, and for people with a history of child protection removals, call or visit from statutory child protection workers. And that really points, I think, to the need for, empathy and understanding of the impacts of our interactions. And an ongoing assessment, perhaps, rather than a point-in-time assessment, which often generally occurs early on when parents are most stressed and apprehensive about what's going on, most triggered. And it also reframes our work a little at working towards reducing or addressing that sort of systemic advantage which might trigger the challenges in parenting. Thirdly, there are health challenges, possible difficulties with pregnancy or in the perinatal phase with some of those parental tasks like bonding and breastfeeding, giving birth, which happen partly due to the changes in levels of hormones. So that points to the need for really good perinatal care, including possibly screening and psychoeducation. So providing people with that information so that they may be less self-blaming, self-shaming. It also points to consideration of these intergenerational aspects of trauma when responding after a child death. And acknowledging that illness and disease in families, which inevitably places more stress and adversity on the family system, is more prevalent in families, maybe more prevalent in families who have experienced trauma. However, the research also tells me that we have a natural impetus to heal. I often use this analogy of a cut or a physical injury when I'm talking to families about psychological trauma. Over time, generally, the injury will heal on its own in many cases if it's kept clean and hygienic, if the environment is conducive for healing. There may be a need for intervention, something like stitches or resetting a bone or a cast or surgery sometimes, but then the body just does its work. So it's kind of an empowering outlook that helps families to know that healing from trauma is not just possible, but kind of innate, kind of automatic. And it also reframes our roles as influencing environmental factors, supporting the right conditions for healing to take place. So that could involve working to remove or otherwise address those impediments to healing, you know, things like violence and poverty. And that could be systemic work. It could also be practical support with families around accessing brokerage, helping to negotiate complex systems. I think healing and narrative are very connected. So we have this responsibility, I think, to find out what safe communication looks like to the family and facilitate that, to reframe any shame or silence and allow the trauma story to be told in a, you know, contained and supported way, so it doesn't sort of spill over into other places. And also remembering that talking is not the only method of sharing the story. And maintaining that family connection over generations. So recalling the potential for the third generation to sort of heal their parents in a way and their grandparents, and that the healing goes up and down the generations. It's reciprocal, not something that it can be done on its own. And I also think about whether we can do better as a system in providing people with opportunities to engage in activism, to influence political decisions and take a leadership and justice-seeking role. Okay, so a couple of references. And before I wrap up, I'll just provide this reference to a paper written by myself and my fabulous supervisors and co-authors. It provides a written version, really, of much of what we talked about today with a bit more detail, a bit more context. So if it's something you're interested in, you're very welcome to have a look at this paper. It's called Inherited Vulnerabilities and Innate Remedies, to really emphasise both the positive and the sort of detrimental aspects of intergenerational trauma. So it is open access, so it's freely available. Thank you all for your time and your interest. I hope the topic of intergenerational trauma is as fascinating for you as it is for me, and I hope you've benefited from the discussion. Thanks. Have a great day.